Well, greetings, and welcome to the 25th Annual Kuehnast Lecture in Climatology. My name is Kenny Blumenfeld. I'm a climatologist working for the state of Minnesota, and today I'm honored to be your Master of Ceremonies, and this is some ceremony. We are here today for three reasons. Those of us involved in public service climatology are here to celebrate a rich legacy of climate information sharing that is decades old and has really made Minnesota one of the most climate conscious and really climate intelligent places in the world. Others of us are here because of tradition. Every year in the fall, for this lecture series, we bring in world-class climate thinkers to illuminate our conversations during this darkening season. And of course, really, we are all here today to hear from the gentleman seated right over there, Dr. Mark Seeley, Minnesota's beloved, adored, deep-voiced, storytelling, joke-cracking, hard-working, history-loving, state-touring, good-spirited, gentle giant of climatology, or, as some of us say, Minnesota's greatest climatologist, period. Now, today's lecture is special because it's the 25th one, which is some milestone, and because it is being delivered by Mark, who has run the Kuehnast program for the majority of its existence, and because in January, as some of you know, and maybe many of you know, he is retiring from his post at the University of Minnesota. So, this is a big deal for us, and we are thrilled that so many of you came here to share this moment. So, I just want to say I have the easy part here. I get to say a bunch of things and introduce people and try not to make a mess of this program. But I do want to acknowledge that Dr. Tracy Twine is the new chair of the Kuehnast Committee, and she's actually responsible for today's program. And she orchestrated much of this while on sabbatical, in California, no less. And you're going to get to hear from her at the end of the program. And I should mention that she was assisted heavily by the extremely able Carrie Jarko and Stacy Nordstrom, who actually might be the two most important people in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. We had further help from Pete Boulay and of course the good people here at the McNamara Alumni Center. So, we all want to hear Mark speak. That's why we're all here. And we're going to bring him to you as quickly as we can, but this series actually has a tradition of honoring its roots and its supporters. And nobody appreciates honoring others more than Mark Seeley. So today, we don't skimp on this tradition. Moreover, Mark has many admirers. You know, when we were creating this program, we put out a call. Who would like to say some things about Mark before he speaks? Come talk to us, make your case, maybe recommend someone. And here's who came to pitch us ideas. You can see it up there. Okay, I believe that this is actually the line for free grilled corn. But let's be honest, Mark's actually more beloved than grilled corn. And in Minnesota, that's really saying something. And in truth, we easily could have had hundreds of people come up here to sing his praises. And you probably know that Mark is an extremely conscientious, gracious, generous, and humble man. He goes out of his way to acknowledge all of the colleagues, collaborators, volunteers, industry leaders, policymakers, public radio listeners, farmers, and other regular folks who have made his career the massive success we are celebrating today. You may have seen this talk advertised as 40 years as an extension climatologist, but you probably didn't know that we had to talk Mark out of his original title, which he sent to us this summer. There it is. Now, that would have been some talk. I think we're glad with what we're going to hear today. But it is true. Mark has been, and I'm not joking, he's been agonizing over who might have been left out today. Be it in the lineup itself, the audience, maybe in his own remarks. He's such a sweet guy, he doesn't want anyone who deserves to feel appreciated to miss out on that opportunity. So I promised him I would help emphasize there couldn't possibly be enough time to thank all the people who deserve thanks, but I want to assure everyone, and you know who you are, that he has not forgotten you. So please think of today and everything you see today. It's a mere sampling of important figures in Mark's career. So, as I said, we're going to honor this program's roots, its supporters, and a small sample of Mark's professional peers are going to then come and make some brief comments. And then we will hear from Mark. So let's start with the roots. You know, you come to a public seminar like this, it often has someone else's name attached to it, and that creates a bit of a barrier that we'd like to remove. For one, I know that most Minnesotans are probably too polite or too reserved to admit that they don't know how to pronounce the name of this lecture series. I mean, who is this Kuehnast anyway? It's a fair question, and I'm happy to provide an elementary explanation. So, and this is my take on it. Earl Kuehnast was Minnesota's first modern-era state climatologist, and he was a visionary. Every day, my colleagues and I benefit from his efforts decades ago. I mentioned how climate conscious and climate intelligent our citizenry is. Earl, along with the late Don Baker, built that consciousness from nothing. They authored thousands of pages of comprehensive, eloquent, scientifically valid, yet broadly accessible summaries of our seasons, our temperature patterns, our rainfall, our snowfall, our sunlight, our wind, and much more. What they learned about our climate was then leaked to the public through their own efforts and also through excellent communicators like Dr. Seeley. And Earl's curiosity was never ending. His devotion to service knew no bounds, and as a result, no climatological stone was left unturned. Now, I love that I can look into his work and I can see which questions kept him up at night. And you can see years of devotion to those questions. His legacy of greatness and ingenuity has continued through the line of subsequent state climatologists, from Jim Zandlow to Greg Spoden, who retired last year, to Luigi Romolo, who joined us this year. His legacy of outstanding service to Minnesota is alive and well in Pete Boulay, and of course in Dr. Seeley himself. In our line of work, climatological servants, we have to ask, where would we be without Earl Kuehnast? Well, we would be much farther behind indeed. And Earl's contributions alone would justify a lecture series, definitely. But after his passing, his family generously created an endowment with the University of Minnesota. And the interest from that gift covers this lecture series and gives students and some other opportunities to attend conferences. So I would like to ask Al Kuehnast, Earl's son, to come up and say a few words. Please, let's welcome Al Kuehnast.
Well, we got to go back to the summer of 1992. My sisters, Bill Larson, and I sat in my mom and dad's dining room table discussing how could we honor our parents' legacy. And that weather was always an important part of our life and a part of our household. It began when my mom and dad were born in northern Iowa as farm kids. They realized the importance of weather and how it affected their crops and their everyday life. For 23 years, my dad was in the Air Force with my mother by his side. And during those 23 years, he had the opportunity to be a command pilot, and he recognized the importance of the knowledge of weather because it meant the safety of his crew. He also served as a meteorologist during that time, forecasting and briefing Air Force pilots on weather conditions. After retiring from the Air Force, he He became state climatologist in Minnesota for 8 years. During those 8 years, he loved to tie climatological data with real-life situations. And that's so. My dad was passionate about weather and the topic of weather. He loved to study it and loved to share with people, anyone that would listen, and that he loved to share that information with them. It is for that reason that we established the Kuehnast Lecture series. We wanted to provide information, ideas, and concept and share it with professionals and students about applied climatology. Now, we never imagined that this lecture series would have grown and have been successful as an avenue of education and learning. However, we understand that it would never exist without the people behind the scenes. And if I forget names, I do apologize, because I know there's more than just the list that I have. But I would like to start with the late Don Baker and Bill Larson, Sue Shepard, Jim Zamlo, Craig Spoden, Dave Rushing, Pete Bollet, John Baker, Carrie Jarko, Kenny Blumfeld, Luigi Romulo, and Tracy Twine. And then I also have to mention 2 family members who have been here representing the family. I would like to recognize my sister Sue Nelson, who's been here to 24 out of 25 lecture series, and my dad's first cousin, Jerry Keene, who's been here for 23 out of 25. That's And of course, the man of the hour, Mark Seeley. So much of the success of the Kuehnast Lecture series was because of you, Mark. We are so grateful for your 25 years of dedication, generous commitment, support, outstanding leadership, and exceptional guidance for the success of our parents' legacy. Our dad would have been embarrassed to have this event named after him, but he would truly have been honored and thankful for it. And he would have wished he was here at each one to be an active participant. So, at this time, I would like to have my sisters come through, and Mark, please come up. You know, I've watched you, Mark, give many plaques over the years, and so we decided that this was fitting for you in that. Mark, on behalf of the Kuehnast family, we would like to, first of all, give you applause for all your hard work. And Matt, we'd like to present you with the plaque, a little token of our appreciation for your 25 years of exceptional leadership and your guidance to the Kuehnast Lecture series. Thank you.
Oh, you can stay up here, Mark. You're going to need a special shelf for plaques you get today. For many years, this lecture series has benefited from additional contributions from the University Chapter of Sigma Psi, which is the scientific research honor society that seeks to enhance the health of the research enterprise, foster integrity in science and engineering, and promote the public's understanding of science for the purpose of improving the human condition. Please welcome Nancy Herther, who is the current president of the University of Minnesota Sigma Psi chapter.
Well, I've been told I have 4 minutes, so I'm going to keep this short. And the plaque isn't here yet, so I had to make this up. Sigma Psi has been here on campus, believe it or not, since 1896. So we're quite an institution. Are there other members of Sigma Xi that are here today? There are some. Wonderful. Very happy to have you here. And we certainly welcome more members. The whole point of Sigma Xi is to make awards to people based on their potential and their promise and their performance in the sciences. So of course, we've got somebody over here who has already been doing a lot of that, and that is Mark Seeley. Again, we have a real plaque, but it was not ready today, so this will be a little easier for him to carry. And I want to read what this says. Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society, University of Minnesota Chapter, hereby recognizes and celebrates the career achievements of Mark M. Seeley on the occasion of his upcoming retirement for his excellence in teaching, research, and publication, his resolute advocacy for greater public understanding of climatology and meteorology, and for exemplifying the highest ideals of an engaged academic in service to his field, his institution, and our world. So I'm very honored on behalf of Sigma Xi to present you with this.
Well, if you're like me, then you try not to look too deeply into Mark's affiliations with the university because you might get confused. Mark has been affiliated with the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. It's one of his affiliations. And Dr. Carl Rosen is the chair of that department. It goes way back with Mark. So would you please come up here, Carl, and say a few things.
Thanks, Cathy. After 25 years, I think I figured out how to spell Kuehnast. It's U-E-H. Yeah. I always get that mixed up. Anyway, welcome to the 25th annual Kuehnast Lecture. And as Kenny said, this is a very special event, somewhat bittersweet, because we all know it will not be too long before Mark retires, leaving a huge void for all of us here at the university. Mark's been a faculty member at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate since 1978. I arrived in 1983, so as Kenny said, we do go way back, and it has been a privilege and an honor to work with Mark, not only as a colleague, but also as a friend. Mark grew up in California. He received a BA degree from UC Berkeley in 1969 and an MS degree in meteorology from Northern Illinois University in 1975, then a PhD in climatology from the University of Nebraska in 1977. And although Mark grew up in California, he was destined to return to Minnesota. That's where his grandfather, Ira Seeley, once farmed. And ironically, it was the drought of 1910 that forced Ira to leave his farm near Appleton, Minnesota. Mark tells me he went bankrupt. And he started a new life in California. But it was a drought of 1976 that prompted the Minnesota State Legislature to fund a new climatology position at the University of Minnesota. And in March 1977, Governor Rudy Purpich at the time recommended funding for climatology and computerized weather prediction. The funds were to be used for programs to disseminate information on climate along with its implications for the farmer, small farm marketing, management education, and soil and water conservation. And then in January of 1978, the position was advertised. And I actually have a copy of the original position description right here, believe it or not. The position, I want to read just one couple lines from it because it's very pertinent back then and it's just as pertinent today. So a major function of this position is translating meteorological and climatological information into programs useful in decision-making. Development of a dissemination network for the practical application of climate information to agriculture, forestry, industries, and agencies in Minnesota is an educational function of this position. Mark's done a great job with this. He has really done a great job, without question. One of the most widely recognized and respected University of Minnesota faculty members in the state. His outreach and extension programs for over 4 decades have served broad constituencies of growers and grower groups, crop advisors, extension educators, bankers, journalists, broadcasters, and most importantly, the citizens of Minnesota. He's served as a commentator on Minnesota Public Radio Morning Edition, most recently with Cathy Wurzer, and you'll hear more about that in a little bit. It reaches over 500,000 people each week. We all look forward to his explanation of what happened to weather of the past week, or his prediction for the next week. Even if it's wrong, we like hearing it. And Mark's received a number of awards, and it'd probably take another 10 minutes to go through all of them, but I'm just going to mention a few. Some of the more recent ones include the University of Minnesota Presidential Award for Distinguished Service, that was 1913. 2014, he received the Seal Prize for knowledge contributed to agriculture. And most recently, in 2017, the AgriGrowth Council Award for Distinguished Service. Mark is a gifted educator who uses his background in science to communicate how climate and weather affect agricultural production and how it influences the lives of all Minnesotans. I would say even the climate skeptics respect his opinions because he can back up his statements with hard facts. He has the data. You read his books, it's all there. And his success in this area is just, I would say is just truly remarkable. And he's done so well that he's actually reached what I would say is celebrity status. And we've received calls, recent calls, this is true, from the Seeley climate fans who would like a copy of the poster for this lecture series so they can hang it on their wall. So, it's true, Mark, we really have. So, and so I'm thinking of starting a raffle so as kind of a fundraiser actually. And speaking of which, I don't know if you know, we haven't discussed this, Mark, but in honor of your accomplishments, we have started the Seeley Fund for Climate. This is serious. We have started that, and we really hope to have that for climate research, for students in the climate area, and we hope that it goes a long way. And just coincidentally, this is Give to the Max Day, so there is time if you're so inclined, even today. Now, Kenny, I know that I only have 4 minutes, but I just have, before I get the hook, I just have one more thing to say. I want to thank the members of the Kuehnast family, as well as Sigma Psi, for their support that they've given for this lecture series over the year. It's been greatly, greatly appreciated. And now, Kenny, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carl. That wasn't too bad. You only used like 8 of your 4 minutes. Someone else who goes way back with Mark has supported this program and other climatological activities, and that's Dr. Bev Durgan, who's been the Dean and Director of University of Minnesota Extension. You may hear Mark referred to as Extension Climatologist. You might wonder what that means. Well, as Dean and Director, Bev might be able to tell you, but the Extension is a statewide organization with over 800 employees located in all 87 counties of Minnesota and has 15 regional offices. So let's please welcome Dean Bev Durgan.
Well, good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here today to congratulate Dr. Seeley on his 40-plus years career as an extension faculty here at the University of Minnesota. And also I'd like to congratulate you, Mark, for being selected to give this lecture on its 25th anniversary. And then finally, congratulations on your upcoming retirement from the University and Extension. And as we've talked, I can't believe you're doing this. So, and I did check with HR, you still have a chance to back out. So if you have some, second thoughts over Christmas and you love this job so much, we will welcome you back. So I know Cindy, but he can come back. So. But again, congratulations, retirement that is, that you have earned, so we're happy for that. Today there are several people that will be speaking today about different aspects of Mark's career, but what I'd like to do today is talk more about Dr. Seeley's extension career. And Mark, in thinking about your career, I recently had a new extension faculty member ask me the question, what does success in extension look like? And immediately I thought of Mark and his career, and your successful career, and how you've been a role model to all of us. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about that conversation I had with this new extension faculty member and how it relates to Mark's career. So I talked to them about what is success in extension. And one is that you can never forget about the science. As Carl said, that science is the foundation for extension education, and you need to know the data. As we all know, no one knows Minnesota climate data like Mark. Whether it's the date of the coldest temperature, the date of the warmest temperature, or the year that we had a declared state emergency for a drought and for flooding in the same month. So Minnesota's climate is a place to make a wonderful career because of what we see with our climate. But it's also the rare person that can put science into practice and in the way that people can understand it and use it. And Mark is one of those rare individuals. Mark can collaborate with the best climate scientists, whether it's in the United Kingdom or with Noaa, and then he can go into a room of county commissioners, like he's going to be doing in a couple weeks. He rearranged the schedule one more time for us, so that he can talk to the Association of Minnesota Counties and to help them understand how climate data can be used in their decision making. Also, to be successful in extension, you must be willing to form partnerships and look for opportunities to reach people. And no one has done that better than Mark. You'll hear today about his collaboration with public radio, with Almanac, his blog, his newsletter. And Mark never misses an opportunity to reach people. And as we talked, and as Carl said, that he is a household name throughout Minnesota. But also one of the unique characteristics of Mark and what we really need to have happen in extension is that Mark also has been very good at working across disciplines, not just the climate discipline. Whether it's working with entomologists on how weather patterns influence seasonal abundance of aphids, working with weed scientists on the number of working days for mechanical weed control, the impact of weather patterns on predicting poultry diseases in the state, or writing books and working with photographers to tell the story of climate and weather here in Minnesota. In extension, one thing that makes you successful is you need to know your audience. And as you'll hear today, and I think all of you know, Mark is a master of that. Mark can talk to farmers, he can talk to elected officials, he can talk to agencies, he can talk to children, and he can speak the science of weather and climate to all of them. And as we know, we talked about Minnesota is a big state, and I'm sure Mark is one of the few people here in this room today that have been in all 87 counties. Mark knows his audience. And finally, to be successful in extension, you need to care. And this is really what Mark does best. He cares about the university, Mark cares about the citizens of the state, he cares about what he knows and how he can help make a difference in people's lives. And Mark also knows that you need to say yes more than you say no. And Mark has said yes, time and time again, to the many requests and the many people that want him to be at their meetings, that want to talk to him about weathers. weather, and he has said yes to all those opportunities. So with that, Mark, I want to thank you for all you've done for Minnesota. I will miss you, the university will miss you, Extension will miss you, so we hope you keep in touch, and congratulations on a career well done. You are what success looks like. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Bev. Yeah, about saying yes and not no. When Mark does have to say no, it can be a real tragedy to the people who've asked. And I know this because our office gets the calls. So if Mark says no, I'll get a call that goes like this. Is this Dr. Blumenfeld? Yeah, speaking. Yeah, well, we have a function and we really wanted Mark Seeley to come and speak. But he told us that you're pretty good, so we figured we'd give it a shot. And so because of that, I've started referring to myself as Mark Seeley's bench. Yeah, they love it when he says yes, definitely. Okay, so now we're going to hear from some of Mark's peers and admirers outside of the university. So one person who's not able to be here is Twin Cities weather legend Paul Douglas. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read from a note that he did send along, and these are excerpts because Paul had a lot to say. So he said, like everyone else, I was weaned on weather and climate nuggets from Dr. Mark Seeley. He provided perspective, context, analysis. Tell me a story. And nobody told that story better than Mark. He's a master storyteller. Making sense of weather patterns and tracking climate trends has been more than just a job for Mark. It's a passion, at times an obsession. You can't fake that. It's either there or it isn't. Mark has taken his job seriously, but never once have I seen him take himself seriously. The embodiment of Minnesota nice, he is also Minnesota smart, but he didn't rub that in either. Modest, self-deprecating, warm and funny, this great man, who I lovingly refer to as the climate guru, was an inspiration for all of us. They might not realize it quite yet, but the agricultural community is going to miss your updates and predictions and your funny, low-key observations. You work from a bedrock of science, but the words you chose, pure artistry. So now it's Mark's turn to kick back and enjoy the weather without feeling the need to educate or explain. More time for friends and his amazing family. More time to travel, preferably on land. You're going to have to explain that part. Because Paul says, please avoid cruise ships until further notice. A gangplank advisory remains in effect. So congratulations, Mark, on an amazing career, for being our friend and for having such a profound impact on each and every one of us. Minnesota is a much better place thanks to you and your dedicated efforts over the years. Okay, another iconic mainstay of the Minnesota weather enterprise who would like to make some comments is Carol Evans, chief meteorologist, who has been with the station since 1993. Let's please welcome Belinda Jensen.
Well, I was thinking about the fact that if you put this many meteorologists and climatologists in the same room, you'd think we could have a nicer day outside. I don't know about you guys, but it's cold, Mark. It's really cold. It's been cold for a while. The reason I am in the Carol Evan backyard is because of Paul Douglas. Paul Douglas answered his phone when I was in 10th grade, and I did a term paper on meteorology for Mrs. Larson's class. And my physics teacher at the time, Mr. Gavin, thought it might be smart for me to do that because my older brother was the smart one, and he thought maybe I could learn a few things. And if I did a term paper on science, it might not be a bad idea, even though I thought that I was going to be a social studies teacher because I was really good at states and capitals when I played my... So my career winds down a very interesting road that starts with a mentor really Paul Douglas. And growing up in beautiful Prescott, Wisconsin, on the St. Croix with 3 brothers and a sister, and being outside and not being able to come back in until Dad whistled for dinner, and spending lots and lots of time outdoors. And as I was talking to 634 students this morning in New Prague, telling them, do you guys play outside? Are you guys outside? You're outside, right? And they're looking at me like, yeah, we're outside. And I think that that is something that is so, so important, and something that was instilled in me as a kid. And then I was able to move forward, do this term paper, learn about meteorology. And Paul hates when I tell this story. Doug hates when I tell this story, because he's like, well, that really ages me. I'm like, that really ages me too. So, and along with that, I interned for Paul Douglas, and then after that, he called me after my first job in Salt Lake City. And he said, hey, the weekend position's open. And I said, hey, that's great, but there are way too many old boyfriends and English teachers, and I am just gonna stay in Salt Lake City for a little while. But the moment I came in 1993, and the reason I came to KARE 11 in 1993 was actually a climatological, interesting weather pattern that had set up June of 1993, where it wouldn't stop raining. It wouldn't stop raining. And so when they put me on the chroma key and told me to try out for this job, they put a microphone on me and they said, go. And there was no one in the studio. They'd gone to lunch. And I started doing the weather, and Doug had left me 3 maps. Thanks, Doug. Maybe 4 or 5 would have been better. And I'd been doing the weather for 3 years, and I was 25 years old, and I was talking about why it was raining, and why it kept raining, and why the Mississippi and the Missouri River came together, and the confluence moved 100 miles north, and towns became islands, and KARE 11 was sending water to Iowa. And I kept explaining it, and then in the control room, I come to find out that they were saying, does she have an IFB on? No. Is there anyone in there? No. Where's Jim? He went to lunch. Well, let's just see how long she goes. And 13 minutes later, I got the job. Because if you can talk 13 minutes about weather and actually have it sound a little bit like sense, they'll give you the job. And Mark Seeley is a man that I called, that I looked up, and I called within my first month at KARE 11, because they wanted me to do a story about if it is going to be a La Nina winter, is it going to be darn cold and snowy? And they wanted, of course, me to do that story within 2 minutes, and it had a lot of data, and I came to your office, and I sat down with you, and you explained to me how to figure it all out, and you spent all this time with me, and we had just met. And when I was thinking about this today, I went and found this book, and this book is the first book that I had on weather in college. And I was looking at all my earmarks, and I was looking at all my highlights. And now that I'm thinking about it, I should have been a climatologist, because it's so much more interesting. And trying to figure out the next 7 days and put it on everyone's phone is just not that fun sometimes. And I have to say that over the years, trying to make sure we have that nugget that Paul Douglas taught us to have the nugget, have them go away with not only the 7-day forecast, but have them go away with something that are like, that's interesting. Maybe we should talk about it tomorrow at work, or maybe we should think about it. And with Mark's unbelievable information right at your fingertips now, and of course in the books prior to that, and on the phone prior to that, I cannot tell you how amazing it is to have a resource like that that you can tap into with credible, fantastic information, that all you have to do is figure out how to get it into a graphic and put it on the news at night. And being able to disseminate that information, and thank Mark Seeley and the Extension climatologist and your group, and being able to be that person that gets to communicate that information is very, very humbling. And it is very wonderful. And I so appreciate that you have asked me to do this, because my team, Jeff Edmondson's in the room here with us, Sven Sungar, Laura Betker, and the people in the KARE 11 newsroom, really, really do appreciate the fact that we have this resource that we can tap into where we can get very good information. And in the meantime, I had the privilege of writing the foreword to one of your books, which when you called, I couldn't believe it, and I so appreciated that. And I got to go and hang out with him at Barnes & Noble a bunch of times and sign books, and how wonderful for me to do that. So life is really about surrounding yourself with wonderful people and filling your bucket with people that fill your heart and fill your brain. And Mark Seeley is in my bucket, thankfully. And I so appreciate being able to come down here for a few minutes. And I want to let you know that I do have to sneak out because it is ratings and there is a newscast at 5 o'clock that I have to be a part of, and Jeff and I will be there. And we will be able to show this video tonight at 10 to continue that tradition. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Belinda. That was great. Yeah, when we think about, you said you should have been a climatologist. You know, people often don't know, climatologists have it kind of easy because, you know, the meteorologists, they have to be wrong sometimes, but when you are looking at last week's weather or yesterday's weather, you're right every single time. So, now Mark Seeley knows a lot of people. He's really casual about it. One Friday we were talking about our weekends and I asked if he had any interesting plans and he said, well, I'm supposed to meet with Robert Redford. His family calls him Bobby. And what are you doing? Well, not that. But that's how Mark is. Apparently the Seeleys and the Redfords knew each other. And so it should have surprised me when Mark casually told me one day that Ben Santer was interested in having lunch with us. What? You know Ben Santer? Well, of course you do, because you're Mark. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Benjamin D. Santer is he's like our Robert Redford. He deals in heavyweight climate issues. He's a great climate scientist of our time. He deals with issues like climate model and intercomparisons. His work is important enough that without a deliberately public forum, you still might see him, for example, on Late Night with Seth Meyers. In 1998, he was awarded the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. We've been lucky enough to have Dr. Santer to the Kuehnast Lecture Series 2 times, and he would like to share a few thoughts about Mark. So please welcome Dr. Ben Santer.
Thank you, Kenny. I still have to pick up the dog poop at home. I first met Mark 15 years ago when he invited me to be one of the participants in a Kuehnast panel discussion. That was a truly memorable event. Mark was also unforgettable. That quiet, cultured voice, the understated authority, the willingness to listen, to see the world through the eyes of others, an imposing physical presence coupled with deep humility and humanity. Even at that first meeting, it was easy to understand why, when Mark Seeley spoke, others would listen. Communicating climate science is tough in today's world. It's easy to become dispirited by the gap between the science and the effective actions required to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. It's easy to focus on communicating with those who want to listen to what you have to say and to ignore those who don't. In the past year, we've learned where the ignoring others road can lead us. As state climatologist, Mark did not have either the luxury or the intention of speaking to a single narrow audience. He had to interact with a wide range of different constituents. Some constituents had concerns about climate science and climate scientists. They needed to hear a trusted, respected voice. They needed someone who did not just provide dry facts and figures, but was willing and able to understand their problems and concerns. Mark was and is that trusted voice. I've learned a lot about science communication from Mark. Listen, reach out to others, not just to your peers. Get out of your office and understand the concerns people have in the less traveled places, the places that are often forgotten. Remain calm in difficult circumstances. Show your humanity, not just your science. Localize the global. Try to understand, in Mark's words, how climate is changing in your own backyard. Over the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to spend some time with Mark, often when he kindly drove me to and from the U of M during my visits to Minnesota. I've marveled at his dry, understated humor, like the story he told me about setting his university gown on fire during a graduation ceremony. Man, I'm really sorry I wasn't there to witness that one. I've been privileged to hear him lecture, to listen to his radio broadcasts, privileged to witness a master communicator at work. During one of our car rides, Mark told me that his philosophy was to, quote, keep on doing whatever it is you're good at for as long as you possibly can, unquote. That is the best possible advice for these challenging times. Mark, I have no doubt that, even in retirement, you will still be a trusted voice on all matters related to climate science. And I have no doubt that you will remain an inspiration to many. You sure are an inspiration to me. I wish you and Cindy and your family all the best for the coming years. Thank you for your friendship and for being the best possible ambassador for climate science.
Thank you, Ben. All right, we're about ready to bring Mark up here, but really, I am not up to the task of introducing him. You know, when we were planning this, like, hey, all these people are going to come up and say these great things about Mark because he's such a great guy, but I kind of want to know. I kind of want to know what he's like when he spills the coffee. So we're going to have Cathy Wurzer do it. Cathy and Mark go way back, and they've worked together at the State Fair, on the public television show Almanac, and most famously every Friday for, how long has it been?
I'll tell you later.
Okay. A little while on NPR's Morning Edition. They even ran a podcast together. Remember that? You guys remember that? Jet streaming?
Something wrong with that title.
Of all of Mark's peers, Cathy probably knows best what Mark is like before the sun has risen, when he didn't get nearly enough sleep, or perhaps when he did spill coffee on the microphone. I'm sure Mark's a professional and he never really did that, but surely Cathy can tell us something we don't know about Mark. So please help me welcome the longtime host of Almanac and Morning Edition, Cathy Wurzer.
We have a multimedia introduction to you, my friend. And that photo is proof positive of what happens to a person waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning for years. And I'm not talking about Seeley, I'm talking about myself. I think I am safe in saying that I'm one of a very few, very select number of women. I'm at least one of 2 who are the first to see Mark in the morning, at least on Fridays. And I thank Cindy, we hope, yes. And I thank Cindy. I thank Cindy, Mark's beloved and long-suffering wife, for allowing him to get out of the house each Friday. So he arrives at NPR at 6:35. Maybe she's happy to have him out of the house early. I haven't asked her. Mark, bless his heart, is like a mail carrier. No matter the weather, he treks into the studio from his home near the St. Paul campus every week, like clockwork. Listeners get to have a first-hand account of the good, the bad, and the ugly, the news. That's my job. Mark talks about the slippery, the snowy, the rainy conditions, the hot, the humid, the cold that day, and he talks about what transpired in the atmosphere earlier in the week. Here's the amazing part. Mark Seeley has been making the trip to our St. Paul studios almost every Friday morning for 25 years. Oh. Our on-air weather conversations are the most popular segment on Morning Edition. That isn't fake news, that's a fact. And Lord knows a number of my former bosses have been puzzled as to why a live on-air segment on the weather works. Radio programmers and broadcast consultants have scratched their heads over the years. On paper, it just does not make sense, but it doesn't matter what they think. Listeners love Mark's weather segment. As an armchair wannabe meteorologist, I adore Mark and our weather chats, and I'm joined by thousands of others who agree. There are many reasons for Dr. Seeley's popularity. One, of course, is that Minnesotans love the weather, right? Our weather is endlessly fascinating and frustrating, and sometimes both at the same time. We love to talk about the weather in these parts, so the subject matter matters. Mark sounds like one of us, so much so that folks are shocked to learn that he is from California, as you heard earlier. His grandfather, of course, farmed near Appleton in the early 1900s. And maybe that's why Mark's got that great Minnesota accent, don't you know? It's in his blood. Dr. Seeley's weather segments work because he has that very special gift that all the great educators have. And that is, he's able to make complicated subjects interesting and accessible. Mark loves passing along climatological knowledge, not only on the air, but in the form of little email messages. Observe. Oh, hang on. Come on up here. Let's just hang on. This is what I mean by a multimedia presentation. There we go.
Tell Potter that there's an email from Mark Seeley.
Mark Seeley sends me an email this morning noting that the 29 inches of snow recorded
Hey,
in
Lorna,
Tennessee so
there's
far.
an email from Mark Seeley. I'll print it for you.
This email from Mark Seeley, he says, across parts of central and southern Minnesota.
Hey, Potter, there's an email from Mark Seeley.
Yes, the weather is indeed steamy. In fact, Mark Seeley sent me an email this morning noting that we had.
After receiving an email from Mark Seeley, President Clinton says he'll go ahead with this year's Renaissance weekend that may move the Reimagining America seminar indoors.
Thanks for that clear and accurate forecast, Paul. The good news is, though, I just got an email from Mark Seeley, and he says we can expect a great weekend in the Twin Cities.
Mark Seeley, a climatologist of the University of Minnesota, has turned down a special prize for weather forecasting. Responding by email, Seeley says the ceremony falls on a Friday morning. He has a prior commitment that keeps him from traveling to Sweden.
Yeah, there you go. Listen to that old audio tape, evidently even former news anchors Don Shelby and NPR's Carl Castle received Mark's emails. I do too, and the beautiful thing is that I'm not the only one who can say, I heard from Mark Seeley today that in Embarrass, they just set another low temperature record for the umpteenth time. Listeners and colleagues and the more than 5,000 subscribers to the Weather Talk newsletter get that information too. Mark is so generous in sharing information and in sharing his time and his talents. Dr. Seeley, I would dare say, is probably the most recognizable of any University of Minnesota professor. Not only is he a familiar voice, as you know, in NPR, but he is seen over the years on Twin Cities Public Television on that Almanac program and in several weather-related documentaries. And Mark puts me to shame in the number of miles he drives around Minnesota to speak to various groups. Wherever two or more are gathered, there is Mark Seeley. Mark's been around so long that one of the NPR bosses got sick of his theme music. Sorry to do this again. Can you just stand up here with me, honey, would you please? Okay. There you go. Just hit that. Old-timey, to say the least. And at the behest of the big bosses at NPR a few years ago, we at Morning Edition were told to find Mark a new theme song. Morning Edition producer Jim Bickle decided to hold a contest, and the entries had a wide range of creativity to them. We almost went with this one. See, it ain't easy.
Please tell me, Mark Seeley, what'll be the weather today? Will there be gray clouds or sunshine to brighten our way? I like feeling fresh spring showers, seeing summer flowers grow, watching all the autumn colors, catching pure white winter snow. So please tell me, Mark Seeley, what'll be the weather today?
Very catchy. I like that. I like that a lot. I like her voice. She's a good singer.
That's like a classy Seeley response, isn't it? Well, we like that little ditty at NPR, but since Mark is so darned humble, we thought that it would embarrass him each week to play that. So in the end, we selected theme music that is warm, folksy, and upbeat, kind of like the guy who joins me and thousands of listeners every Friday. Ladies and gentlemen, here to deliver the 2017 Kuehnast Lecture and perhaps provide an exclamation point to his storied career as an educator, researcher, climatologist, meteorologist, author, and media personality, please welcome my friend, Dr. Mark Seeley.
How's that? Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. It's my turn. It's my turn. I have a little voice whispering in my ear, hold steady, hold steady. There's so much to look back on, so much to be thankful for over 40 years. It's with mixed emotions that I go into retirement. I'm sure some of my colleagues, many of whom I see out there that have preceded me into retirement, had the same mixed feelings. It's been so rewarding to work with the people of Minnesota and be part of that wide community that we have. But I'm going to do my best. I'll try to put my best foot forward here. Instead of standing behind the podium, I might wander around a little bit and tell my story. It goes without saying that this is vastly different from the previous Kuehnast lectures in terms of the approach here. There is going to be some embedded science, so if you came for that purpose. There's also going to be some history and stories and some people. And so that's the way we're going to do it. I realize there's probably a variety of expectations in play here, and I hope that different segments of what I'm going to talk about will meet some of those expectations. So here we go. The cover on this slide is simply the March for Science that occurred last April down at the state capitol. We had March for Science actually all over the state at that time last April, and I was privileged to be one of the speakers down there and was inspired to see the thousands upon thousands of Minnesota citizens that cared about science, including members of my own family that I was with that day. In looking back, I'll come back around to the March for Science a bit later, but in looking back at 40 years, I thought I would approach this. Carl might appreciate this. He might even give me a bonus here before I retire. in showing the departmental history book, but I thought I'd approach it a little bit like my esteemed colleagues and their approach to documenting the 100 years of our academic unit at the University of Minnesota by breaking it down into a little bit of history, science, people, and then some kind of wrap-up thoughts. So I'm kind of following that format a little bit, but I want you to know that it relies on our history, which many, many individuals in this room contributed to in that book project we did a number of years ago. Don Baker was a very persistent man. I see his son Bill and daughter-in-law Mary and grandson James are here today. It's so great to see you here. He was very persistent in coming after me when the legislature created that brand new faculty position back in the 70s as a result of the 1976 drought in Minnesota. I was at the Johnson Space Center at the time, spying on other countries, which was really our task. We went through 3 security pass gates just to get to our office. We had monthly briefings with the USDA Secretary's office. We were tasked with telling the USDA what was going on in the old Soviet Union and China and different trade partners so that we wouldn't get trapped with missing data in negotiating some of our trade contracts and things like that. And so I couldn't really talk freely about a lot of my work. I was kind of muffled in that position, and but I nevertheless felt obliged to complete my work down there. And so the first time Don asked me about the Minnesota job, I just said flat, no, I'm not interested. And then they went through a process with a failed search, and he came back a second time. And the second time I said, well, why not see what Minnesota's like? And came up and interviewed and met a lot of wonderful people and really liked the community, and that's where it started. Cindy and I had a traumatic first year when we moved here. It was 1978. The winter of 1978, see the blue arrow there where the graphic is showing. Unbeknownst to us, we decided to move to Minnesota in the 5th coldest winter in Minnesota history. Very challenging moving up from Houston, Texas. So that's what I looked like trying to carry my briefcase down those icy sidewalks. That's not me modeling the long underwear, but I did wear my long underwear a very long time. And I remember Cindy did make a few comments about that. And then lots of shoveling, lots and lots of shoveling, lots and lots of snow that particular winter. And so it was quite an indoctrination. Wondering what in the world is this place? You might recall that also that's the last time, and I can say this with finite knowledge, that is the last winter, in the Twin Cities at least, that we had 66 consecutive days, beginning on December 2nd, we had 66 consecutive days with a temperature in the Twin Cities, Tracy, the urban heat island of the Twin Cities, that we never saw the thermometer reach 32 degrees. That's the last time that's ever happened here. It hasn't happened since. I immediately recognized as a greenhorn that I needed all kinds of help. And I did get lots of help within Extension at the time. Roland Abraham was our Extension director. Lots of meetings to attend, trying to get on board with the basis of what are the needs, what are some of the needs for better weather and climate information and delivery so that better decisions can be made, and who are some of the players I can lean on and introduction to Noaa and the National Weather Service. And I'm happy to see some members, Steve Buin, Dan Luna, Michelle Margraf, and goodness knows a lot of retired folks from that arena are here. Wonderful partners to work with. I can't say enough about what wonderful public servants they are. But getting introduced there to all the different expertise and the products available. Minnesota State Climatology Office, I'm going to say much more about that later, which is in our Department of Natural Resources. Working with the branch stations, what we now call the research and outreach centers, all the wonderful scientists that were out there in the different regions of the state doing a lot of meaningful work, and then working with the news media, television, Minnesota history, deep love of that, but I'll say more about that later. All of these are very important partners to me as I look back on the 40 years. My work would have been literally greatly diminished without any of these players. It was a wonderful team, and I think my career in that context is more about pure luck and serendipity than intentionality. I mean, I did go to the trouble of meeting and getting to know all these players, but as it turned out, they were all wonderful people, through and through. Very dedicated people to work with. Earl Kuehnast and Don Baker were my two mentors. We don't maybe do this anymore. Those of you at the university might want to hear these words, but once upon a time, when you hired new faculty, greenhorns like me that were barely 30 years old back then, the mentor would meet with the new faculty member minimally each month. Now, Don and Earl had the habit of meeting with me about once a week. And those were the flame burger days because they liked to go to lunch at the Flame Burger. And that's where they were going to rake this new kid over the coals and say, oh, you didn't do this right, but you got to do this, and you got to give priority to this, and you got to do this. But suffice to say, the reason I'm bringing this up is the mentoring was really important. A steady dose of mentoring was really important to me to get a handle on the state I was living in and what some of the issues were. And it was a very pragmatic orientation with Earl and Don. Earl and Don were all about what can we do for you? How can we make this easier? How can we make this decision better? It was all about pragmatism. So my first several years with the extension and with the experiment stations and with the working partnerships I had were all about the pragmatic. And so I'm merely showing you, yes, we did tackle Cercospora leaf spot in sugar beets. How do we forecast it and how do we better treat it? It's still in play today. That work with American Crystal Sugar and Mindac and Southern Minnesota Sugar and others is still in play today. Climate and avian pneumovirus, still a very big threat to Minnesota's turkey growers. And that work is still in play today. Climate and irrigation scheduling, climate and agricultural drainage. And boy, if you don't think climate change has had an impact on these endeavors, holy smokes, it really has. Winter injury to alfalfa, huge topic in Minnesota. Climate and winter application of manure, and we all know about that and the environment associated with that. Climate and post-emergence herbicides. Bev mentioned working with weed scientists here. In the first couple of decades I was here, I worked with some weed scientists on all kinds of things, and the chemistry is so complicated, it just boggled my mind. I felt overwhelmed. I thought, weed scientists, Bev, I thought were absolute geniuses. How could they digest all this data, all this chemistry going on? And then, of course, the entomology. We'll work with not only insect migrations, insect infestations, how do we better predict these? How do we better treat these? Climate and design and deployment of living snow fences. This one is near and dear to my heart. I know some people in the room today were part of this project. I just came from Iowa, and in driving to and from Iowa earlier this week, I told Cindy about this. On highways 169 and Highway 60 to drive down to Iowa, I see places where our living snow fence work of 15 to 20 years ago is in play on Minnesota highways to keep those highways from being plowed so much. And that saves a huge cost. Gary Wyatt, are you still here? There you are, Gary. This is a salute to you and Dan and everybody. That work, magnificent piece of work, absolutely, and still very relevant and in play. Very pragmatic use of the history of our snow climatology in the state of Minnesota. The soils work with Giles Randall, George Reen, I'm losing track, Kurt Overdahl, who else? Bill Finster. I could go on and on. But the problem of looking at nitrogen in the fall season and trying to make that a more effective approach for putting anhydrous or urea on those soils in the fall season by doing a better delineation of where that was appropriate and where the soil conditions could be coped with. And that is still work that's in play very much today. The networks and working with the state climatologists to amplify the networks around the state, get more observers on board. Earl and Don were absolute soldiers at this task. In fact, much of their later careers were totally devoted to this task. We need to get as many volunteer observers in our state as we can. And they were very good at doing this and making use of those data, educating the observers, utilizing the climate networks and making those climate networks available to the public more readily. And then my work for 22 years with school science teachers and educating them about the essence of climate, but also climate change, and that climate change was an important enough issue, it needs to be integrated into the school curriculum. Some of you in this room probably don't know that, but a result of 22 years of working with school science teachers, we now have climate change education materials integrated into the earth science curriculum of hundreds of school districts in our region. And that's fundamental from that work. So, the Extension Disaster Education Network. Now, that's something that actually evolved over time, but Extension is a partner in responding when we have a disaster in the state. It has been throughout its 100+ years of existence. It might be an outbreak of a certain livestock disease. It might be a tornado or a flood. It might be, and this is a stretch, but Extension has responded, it might be a farm financial crisis. Just keeping people afloat, finding ways to keep people afloat. Extension has dedicated a lot of resources to that over the years. In my history here, it's we've seen a lot happen, and a lot of this has happened to your lives. A lot of this maybe has affected what you do, or it's affected the lives of somebody that you care about. Greg Spoden and I were talking about this quite some time ago in our careers. You know, anymore, it's almost an oddity that we go through an entire calendar year here in our state of Minnesota, and we don't have some kind of weather or climate trauma rear its head. That is getting to be, that Don Baker used to call that a benign year, a quiet year. And that doesn't happen very often. That really doesn't happen very often anymore. And in some individual years, this trauma or this episode or this event or whatever it is may in reality translate to an economic impact, either infrastructure damage or insured losses, over $1 billion. In fact, among Midwestern states, Minnesota has suffered through probably about as many years as any other Midwestern state. We don't often come anywhere near close what the southeast coastal states do, but nevertheless. And all the way through time. The time course is you can almost pick any year in the last 40 and you can find some real dramatic impacts of weather or climate on our Minnesota landscape. Starting in, as was already mentioned by Al Kuehnast and others, starting in 1992, we initiated the Kuehnast Endowment Lecture Series. God bless that Kuehnast family for initiating that. It was, and it might have been serendipitous, but I think I'm safe in saying this, there was a convergence of time that came into play with the formation of the Kuehnast Endowment Lecture Series. And the convergence of time was this. At the time, we got the family funding to start to do this lecture series and start to engage the public more broadly was perfectly coincident, and Ben might appreciate this. I don't know if you remember me saying this, but that's the time, awfully close to 1992, when the climate signal of change became emphatic in Minnesota. There was no denying it. Things were changing. It was staring us right in the face. You could all of a sudden see this emerge. All these signals you've been looking at all these years were emerging in our measurements. And that was a happy coincidence because suddenly we had this national scale issue that involved the discipline of climate science, and we had a wonderful engagement series to plug in with. And we have had a wonderful series. Of all the things that have happened with my department, Soil, Water, and Climate, and with my career, this is the one in which I have the most pride. If you look at the list and the topics addressed in the 25 years of this lecture series, they are all really important. And they've all been very well addressed by the people that we've invited here. That's why we've invited Ben twice. If I were still on board, we'd probably invite you a third time a few years down the road. But they're all very important. And we've had a string of terrific scientists participate in this. We're very proud. We're very proud of that. Some of these names, you could Google these names and you would get page after page after page of scientific contribution from these names. And one of these names, in fact, the very first speaker, Stan Chagnon from Illinois, laid down kind of a foundation for us that still serves us well today when he came to talk about why climate is important, why climate science is important. Fundamentally, he wrote papers about this, and some of these are very often quoted papers. Stan's no longer with us, as are many of these people I'm going to talk about, but he talked about through the course of time history, our perceptions of climate behavior have changed. Once upon a time in the founding fathers' days, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, etc., it was thought that the climate, if you monitored it at the same spot on the USA landscape, you could derive a graph like is depicted there in the top graph. You would know everything there was to know about climate behavior at that point in the USA. You'd know the seasonality, the mean values or the central values, the extremes and everything. So you'd know everything you needed to know about climate behavior at that spot. And then a while later, maybe a century or more later, we suddenly realized, as shown in the second graphic, that in continental places like Minnesota, yes, we can define the central character of our climate, but the variability around that central character waxes and wanes over time. Sometimes one year's like the next, like the next, like the next, and then other years are vastly different. So you can't use one year to predict the next. They're all over the place. And then lastly, Stan pointed out in his research that we have this trend shift view where all of a sudden one of the signs of climate change that's emphatic is when we start observing populations of measurements in the same location that are outside the historical range. We have no historical analogy for them. And now the point of this paper was in what's in the words at the bottom. We have built, now this is an admission that politicians need to get a handle on. Believe me, I wish every politician had a handle on this, but that's not the case. We have built the management of our natural resources and the design and operation of our societal infrastructure and its management around these historic climate behaviors. So the reason we have a good freshwater supply system or an electric utility grid, or the reason we manage that forest a certain way or this watershed a certain way, is because of our knowledge base of how climates behaved in the past. But more and more and more, climate is behaving outside the historical past. And if we don't grasp that we have to change our management to still make this stuff operate right, we're missing the boat. We are really missing the boat. So, thank you. I didn't say that for applause. It's just that the data, I think you've heard me say this, I've said this on the air with Cathy, I don't know how many hundreds of times over the years. As a climate scientist, the data scream at you when they're this abnormal. They just get your attention, you know what I mean? And that's what's happening. Now, some things we've observed, some things I've observed in my lifetime as serving as extension climatologist, I never in my mind would have expected to see. In other words, if after I came here in the 70s and worked for a few years, I'm going to show you some examples of some things that have really happened and have been measured here in Minnesota that I never in a million years would have anticipated. One of them was the March 31, 2014 tornado and blizzard warning that was going on at the same moment in time in southwestern Minnesota. So if you were on one side of this weather disturbance, you were in a tornado warning with a tornado on the ground. And if you were on the other side of this weather disturbance, you were in a blizzard warning and you couldn't see. Now, how many of you would think that at the same moment in time, in the same geography, you can have that kind of thing operating? I mean, maybe on Mars, I don't know. But in Minnesota, I never would have guessed in a million years that that was even possible. But Dan, you and your staff know well. I mean, those were all your warnings. So, or how many of you remember July 23rd, 1987? Mercy. 10 inches of rain, 6 hours, right here. 10 inches of rain in 6 hours. My family and I were stranded in downtown St. Paul in the old Chimera Theater, which is now the History Theater. Coincidentally, we were stranded with a couple of National Weather Service meteorologists down there. But we couldn't go anywhere for hours because 10 inches of rain in 6 hours. We had no I-94, we had no 694, 494 perimeter corridor. We had no, in fact, our transportation system was totally paralyzed. And by the time we could get away later that night, we drove home from downtown St. Paul to out through Como Park to St. Anthony Park. We drove home following Como Boulevard as if we were driving up a river stream. And the only thing we could tell is by the boulevard trees on either side of the road, we could keep the wheels kind of in the middle of the stream and hope that we were hitting pavement on the way back. That's what that rain was like. Never would have guessed 10 inches of rain in 6 hours. And flooding, widespread flooding. I mean, that, for the weather community in the Twin Cities, that was just absolutely startling. Or June of 2014, the wettest singular month in Minnesota history. Never ever would have guessed it would rain like that. We had 157 daily rainfall records set in June of 2014, and some of our individual climate observers, Michelle would appreciate this because I'm sure she's looked at the data, 24 days. Now wait a minute, how many days in June? 30 days, okay, 24 days. 24 rainy days. Not a good month for golf. But I never would have guessed, in terms of quantity over that larger geography and persistence, I never would have guessed that we would see a month like that transpire. And then thanks to our own state climatology office and the members of the American Association of State Climatologists, this is probably one of the most startling examples of changes in extremes that we have. Throughout Minnesota history, we've had a handful of these so-called mega rain events. You can see by definition a 6-inch one-day rain over 1,000 square miles with a peak core value of 8 inches or greater. In the first 140 years of our state history, we had 7 of these. 140 years, 7. Since 2002, we've had 7 more. And last year, we had 2 in 1 year. Very, very destructive. Again, Mark Seeley, 40 years ago, would never have guessed that we'd ever observe something like this. And the geography of such storms is random. It's not skewed to one location in Minnesota. So we can't say when Mother Nature does get this angry at us and really drop buckets and buckets and buckets that do a lot of destructive damage, it's not that it's favoring one geography. They've been all over the state, and they've been very, very destructive and damaging. And then the wacko drought of 2012. From a scaling standpoint, the most widespread drought since 1936. Over 2,100 American counties were declared by USDA to be in drought disaster. 57 of those counties were in Minnesota. And a very, very widespread drought. And right in the middle, we get the 2 flash floods on the Cannon River, George Ream territory. George, are you here today? There you are, not too far from your place. Mid-June of 2012, all of a sudden, biggest flood crest ever on the Cannon River. And then a week later, biggest flood crest ever up in St. Louis, or Carleton County. And 10 inches of rain over Duluth and 2 harbors. In the middle of a drought year. In the middle of a drought year. And so simultaneously we had, in those coded counties there, we had residents in Minnesota counties that could file for federal assistance with the government for drought relief or flood relief. That's never happened before. That's never happened before. That's our climate system gone wild. That's our climate system gone wild. Or June 17th, 2010. 48 tornadoes in one day. 1 F4 that destroyed the Wadena High School. 48 tornadoes in one day is a challenge. I'm sure Dan Luna hopes that never, ever happens to his office again. 113 tornadoes in that year, which was the one and only year Minnesota led the nation in numbers of tornadoes. Or the heat wave of July 19, 2011. July 19th and 20th of 2011. Those are actual heat index values from that afternoon. 134 at Moorhead, 123 at Pelican Rapids, 116 at Halleck. These are off the charts. There's no historical analogy that is anywhere close to any of these numbers, period. It doesn't exist. But we had measurable conditions. That's what the measurements showed. Never in a million years would Mark Seeley have guessed that Moorhead, Minnesota would have a heat index of 134. Because that's Furnace Creek, Death Valley. That's what that is for those residents in Moorhead, Minnesota. So here's what our data look like, compiled and cared for by the Minnesota State Climate Office. We do see we're upward. We do see that on a historical basis, you and I have lived through some of the warmest years in Minnesota history. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We also note that the geography of the displacement in the temperature signal across our country over the last century does show that the back parts of Minnesota, the northern woods and the central portions of Minnesota, are seeing pronounced change in temperature. Very pronounced change in temperature. This has something to do, by the way, with the political divide in our country. Because as Ben, I think, quoted me earlier, I do believe that our leaders pay more attention to what's happening in their backyards. So if you note the southeastern states and the southern plains states, sometimes, well, they're not observing the same signals that we are in the rest of the country. And but there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Our state is changing dramatically. There's what I call the King Kong footprint of warmth in 2016. You know, normally when we look at the U.S. and we take a snapshot in time back in history, and all of you that have studied climate history would substantiate this, we see some variation. For crying out loud, if you take a snapshot in time, pick any year in the last 100 years or so, and you look at our country, you're liable to see, oh gosh, it was cold here in New England, but it was hot in Texas. Or, you know, it was warm in California, but it was cold in South Carolina, or it was whatever. You see a lot of mix of different signals. 2016 was pretty emphatic. I mean, every state is reporting one of their warmest years in history. That is a huge signal. That is a huge spatial signal for us. And there's what we're doing so far in 2017. We're keeping on with that. We're keeping on with that signal. There's our precipitation signal. Again, upwards in Minnesota, a lot of wet years. The 2 years already mentioned that impacted my career, 1910 and 1976, still the 2 worst drought years in state history. But a lot of wet years. And there's the signal, the geographic displacement of the signal in precipitation last century or so. Again, Minnesota's right in the core of getting wetter and wetter and wetter and wetter. And all the data are showing that. The data are really showing this signal in our backyard. And there we are in 2016, Great Lakes, currently ranked in 2016, they're some of their wettest years in history. And then there we are so far. Of course, terrible drought this year in North Dakota. Terrible drought that affected agriculture in North Dakota. So, as was already mentioned, one of my books I tackled with the Minnesota Historical Society Press. It took me 6 years. I'm both my attributes in that regard to taking 6 years to write this book are that I'm a slow learner and I'm slow. So we did get around to finally getting it done, and it was a documentation of 1807 to 2005, every significant event and all the historical statistics. But then Minnesota Historical Society Press came to me a while later, I think about roughly a decade, let's call it a decade, past. Can you revise that one more time before you retire? You've been talking about, you know, climate is changing and we should be looking at new numbers. And so I thought, well, yeah, is that really justified? You know, you always ask the question, and Ben's great at this in terms of validation and justification. If you want a role model, just read some of Dr. Santer's work. So I got to think, well, is it really true? Have we seen that much change? So in the decade between those editions, we had set 17,000 new daily climate records in our observer network in the state. That's a pretty big number. And we had set 155 new statewide records. By that I mean we had measured something on a calendar date in Minnesota that had never been measured before. 155 times. So this gets back to what Stan Chagnon was saying. When your climate pattern is behaving outside the historical range with this huge frequency, you better pay attention to it. So then we did and we put the second edition out. Now, I saved this most emotional part for me for last, and I'm hoping this is the part where the voice in my ear that's saying, steady, Mark, steady, steady. There's a risk here. It's an unintentional one. I'm going to start showing you and talking about people that are really important to me. And I may, because of lack of photographic evidence or lack of memory, I may not mention you. All of you are important to me, period. But I'm going to go through some of this anyway. There's the people that have kept me sane. Adam, Emma, Cindy, and Alex. They still keep me sane. I hope they'll keep me sane into retirement. I'm blessed with all of them. My roots in Minnesota. This man is long since gone, but this is Ira Seeley. He founded the town of Mazeppa in Wabasha County in 1854. He served in the territorial legislature from 1854 to 1858. In the harsh winter of 1856-57, he helped write the Minnesota State Constitution so we could apply for statehood in 1858, and then he served in the legislature from 1858 to 1862. He's buried in the Mazeppa Cemetery in Wabasha County. Every time Cindy and I visit down there, we're treated like celebrities, not because of the radio, but because we're offspring of the founder of that town. So Ira was, and that my love for history is partly, and this is an admission, it's partly because my roots are deep in Minnesota. His son served in the Minnesota Regiment in the Civil War, and his grandson was a farmer here in Minnesota and was a member of the Minnesota Farmers Union. So my love for history is not just about climate history, it's love for Minnesota history. And then there's the man for which this endowment is named, wonderful mentor, very, very logical thinker. He could tie weather, and you all know this, he could tie weather into anything, right? He probably tied weather into Lee's cookie. What was on the table? What was on the table that night was probably, he probably told a story about that or whatever. And Earl was also, from a pragmatic standpoint, and a partner with the National Weather Service. He did all kinds of meaningful work that has forever stuck. The Explosive Fire Weather Day. Okay, we do occasionally have the kinds of meteorological conditions that set up in our state that cause an explosive fire weather day. Dan Luna and his staff now put out red flag warnings for that sort of environmental condition. But Earl, way back working with Joe Strube and John Graff and all these old names, contrived that. He also looked at climate as it relates to mosquito populations in Minnesota. Now there's a good one. There's a good one right there. Our state bird. So, and he also looked at color change, autumn color change. DNR does a magnificent job of organizing that and showing us where we can go for our autumn trips and stuff like that. And some of that work in anticipating color change, Earl started decades ago with the climate look. He bolstered our network. I think in his time as state climatologist, our observational networks in the state, I'm not going to give you a number, I'm just going to give you a graphic, I'm going to give you a hand graphic. In Earl's time as state climatologist, we went from this many observations to this many observations. He was evangelical about that, in getting as many observations as possible. And I could not have had a better mentor. And of course, he teamed in that mentoring with Don Baker. Don was the one that recruited me to come to Minnesota. He was a gentleman and a scholar. He was a very pragmatic man. Up in the upper right is Dick Skaggs, and I hope I won't speak out of turn. Dick and Don co-taught at the university the climate and meteorology courses for decades. And I think it was Dick that convinced Don, as pragmatic as Don was, they both contrived to reconstruct the Eastern Minnesota record. And I think in their act of doing that, his colleagues, Dick actually talked Don into climate change being a real issue. I think Dick was a real advocate for that. And then, of course, Don got a very distinguished career. He got the University of Minnesota Award for Lifetime Contributions. He's there in the lower right with his longtime pal, Dave Rushy, who really helped him manage the Climatological Observatory on the St. Paul campus and got him through a lot of his publications. Bill Breiter from the ARS is there, and of course Greg Spoden, one of our former state climatologists. Don was beloved by all of us. We all looked at Don as not only a academic role model, he was a role model for behavior in any setting. And that's how he was valued as a colleague. There's our crew that did the living snow fence work, with apologies to Gary and Dan because they're not in the photo. One of the finest pieces of work, and this is pure serendipity. That's Amy Baker, Martha Shulsky and her husband John, Kenny Blumenfeld and me celebrating after Martha's work was done. That was a team that just serendipitously came together, and it was a wonderful mix of competency, it was a wonderful mix of communications, a wonderful mix of playing off each other's strengths and putting all the pieces together. That program is still used today, and it's been nearly 20 years. We were given the State of Minnesota Partnership Award for that work. And it's something that I think we're all very, very proud of, serving the people of Minnesota to keep the roads, or a lot of these problematic spots on our roads, safe in the wintertime. And then here's another group from celebrating when my first book from Minnesota Historical Society came out. We went down to the Historical Society office, and some of those people you'll recognize. I'm not going to name all those people, but I am going to say something real briefly. Bill Larson and Don Baker and Ray Almirez are in that picture. And they all meant a lot to me as mentors as well. They're all gone now, but we have scholarship and endowments at the University of Minnesota named in their honor. And I have wonderful memories, as I'm sure many of you do, of those individuals. Worked with the Weather Service. Two guys I admired and learned a lot from. Gary McDivitt was the service hydrologist for many years. When there were huge floods and we had community meetings to go out and have dialogue with those communities about flood recovery and about doing a better job of flood forecasting and doing all kinds of different things and bringing different partners into play to help those communities recover from floods. Gary was magnificent at that sort of thing. And believe me, in his time as service hydrologist, we had a lot of those incidents occur. And Rich Neistat was the science and operations officer and one of the best forecasters I ever knew. And he was always there. I even occasionally called Rich at home, not just on duty. He let me call him at home to get a second opinion about something, because forecasters always like to get second opinions. You know, it helps you. And then if you're wrong, well, at least two of you were wrong. So, Bev Durgan, again, I can't give enough thanks, a lot of support to Bev for extension over the years. I've survived, I wrote this, I'm not sure, I've survived 6 university presidents, 13 college deans, 7 extension deans, and 5 department heads. It's not, as with any of our careers, any of our professional careers, it's not all a bed of roses, is it? I mean, we've gone through some pretty challenging times. Some times have been quite difficult to negotiate, and other times have been easier. And so it hasn't all, believe me, I've had the door slammed in my face a number of times. I've had no said a number of times. And I'm sure that's happened to many of you. And you endure this, you go on, you keep moving forward. That's about all we can do. That's about all we can do. Observers. Richard Fesser, Springfield, Minnesota, longtime observer there with Gary McDivitt, Steve Buellen, and Craig Edwards, the former chief out at Chanhassen. Thousands of volunteers like Richard have built the Minnesota State database that we rely on to decipher our climate history, our climate trends, and our climate future. We use their measurements. Thousands of people have put volunteer hours into this over time, and we don't really extend enough appreciation in that direction. Shannon Pinnefeather, wherever she is, I'm not going to ask you to stand up. She's sitting over here. She saved me twice with both editions of the Minnesota Weather Almanac. Those of you that have written books probably value your editors just as much as I do. She has made the book read a lot better, I can tell you, than what the first draft looked like. So I'm forever grateful for her. And if I ever do get enough gray cells concentrated on one topic to write another book, I'm going to be calling her up. She's been fantastic. And then one final word of thanks. Yes, this is a very famous person, and I didn't know her. I did not know her personally. Cindy and I did go to one or two of her lectures over the years. But this is coincidental. This is another one of these convergence of circumstances. That's why I say my career is so much about convergence of circumstance and pure luck. 1992, she was the poet laureate for the Clinton administration in the 90s. Very well-spoken person. One of her quotes that stuck with me, words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with deeper meaning. That came along for me, that inspiration came along for me at just the right time. Bruce McDonald, God bless you, Bruce. I see you. Thanks for coming today. Invited me to come down in 1992, from which that Maya Angelou quote is from, and audition. Now, he didn't say it was an audition. He said, why don't you come down and talk to Bob Potter about the weather on Morning Edition? Okay. So I came down to NPR and talked to Bob. And then the next thing you know, well, why don't we do this on Fridays? Red Barber has passed away. Remember? Red Barber used to have the Friday spot, right? And talk to Bob Edwards all the time. And Red Barber passed away, and so Bob Edwards took a sabbatical leave to write a book, Fridays with Red. And then I went down there, and all of a sudden I'm talking to Bob Potter on Fridays. And all of a sudden I'm having to think, my mindset, I'm having to think, what am I supposed to talk about this week? What am I supposed to talk about this week? What am I? And all of a sudden, but that's how this thing evolved. And I had wonderful years with Bob Potter. We became very good friends. I learned a lot from Bob. Over that interval, I got the privilege of talking to Cathy Wurzer once or twice on Mid-Morning, because although she doesn't tout her career on Mid-Morning, you hosted Mid-Morning for a while, right? And then it blossomed, and then it took off, and then all of a sudden I'm getting emails from people that listen. Now there's something for you, you know. Somebody's out there listening and responding to what you're saying. And then all of a sudden you get into, it's the question of the week format. Or it's, what does this word mean? What does this mean? What's going on with this? What's going on? And all of a sudden it blossoms into something, and pretty soon you're having a community conversation. And my relationship with them now is entering its 26th year. For 22 years, we've broadcast the Minnesota Weather Quiz from the State Fairgrounds. Been wonderful to do that. It's been absolutely wonderful. Gary Eichten and I had a wonderful time, and now in recent years with Cathy and Tom Weber and others, we've had a great time doing that, and I hope even in retirement we can keep doing that. Almanac, another wonderful outlet, especially for events or educational points. And here's where it's important for extension. If you really want to get a message out, there's a platform to get a message out. Because a lot of Minnesota citizens watch Almanac just for the current events content and the way it's handled in a balanced way. And so if you have something you need to get out to people, that's really a good program. And I'm privileged to have the opportunity to speak on that one. And yes, I think this got mentioned earlier, we did experiment with jet streaming. Before podcasts took off like they are today, back in 2008, we had some wonderful guests on there. We did. We had some terrific guests on Jetstream. And we lost Patty Ray Rudolph, the woman there with the woman there. Sorry. This is how brain dead I am. I'm ready for retirement. I'm ready. Anyway, a wonderful soul. I mean that sincerely. Cathy feels the same way. She was a wonderful person. She was our engineer when we were running through that, but 2008 was a downturn. Things fell apart and we couldn't keep it up, but it was a very worthwhile program. Lastly, I want to, since I said I would conclude with citizenship, I just want to bring up these comments, and thanks for bearing with me, and thank you for your patience. The climate change issue, and Ben knows this all too well, is a multi-dimensional issue. We can bring to bear scientific evidence. The cognitive part of it, we scientists do well for the most part. We can bring new knowledge to bear on it. But it has an emotional, an ethical, and a political dimension to it that we cannot escape from. It is impossible to escape from that. And just because it does, should not be a reason for us to shy away from it. Because we're citizens too. I mean, we care, there's so many things we all care about. The similarities between all of us are so striking that we should be able to find some common ground to talk about this topic. And let's not ignore the moral and spiritual dimensions. Let's not ignore that. I can't tell you how many churches I've spoken in the last 10 years, but it's a very large number. All denominations, all faiths, they care about stewardship. They really care. And they care about the community. Teddy Roosevelt did a wonderful job in nationalizing our attitude about conservation. He was a master at this. Conservation is a great moral issue, for it involves the patriotic duty of ensuring the safety and continuance of this great nation. Climate change could be plugged readily into the word conservation in that statement, but we don't have a president that's going to do that. In fact, I wonder if we have a state leader that would do that. I hope one day we do, because we need to see that. We need to be inspired. We need some leaders that are going to inspire us. Extension's role can't be underestimated. We have 15 regional offices. We have extension educators that deal with all kinds of topics that are relevant to Minnesota families and really important for the livelihood of those families. And on this topic alone, we should be fully engaged. We should not only be fully engaged as the University of Minnesota Extension, we should be a leader. When you see the symbols, or you see any public engagement or any kind of event going on in Minnesota associated with dealing with the topic of climate change, Extension should be a partner in this. We have a legacy of helping people through troubled times and not running away from it. We don't just bring knowledge to the table. We bring local credibility, local communications, local connections. We bring the whole university with us. And that's really important to consider into the future in this endeavor. So here we are back at the March for Science. And this is another thing we should never shy away from, is public engagement that promotes our science, whatever the discipline we represent. Many of you have seen me use this slide for years. I'm a proud member of the Cloud Appreciation Society. I even have a card that says I'm member 8,132. For those who doubt or wish to dismiss the evidence that climate is changing, the data indicate it is happening and already producing serious consequences for our state. Whether or not you take a secular or a religious perspective, It is clearly poor judgment to ignore this. Been trying to ram that point home. I'm not of similar stature to many of the people that have spoken in the Kuehnast program over the 25 years. But I think I outweigh every one of them. And I've been trying to throw that weight around as much as I can. I've been trying to throw that weight around as much as I can in the latter part of my career. And I will not, this is the one thing I will not let go away. So even in retirement, I'm going to stay engaged on certain things. And Barb Lukanen is here, she's done the same thing in retirement. We all have certain things we're passionate about that we'd like to stay engaged on, and this is one that I don't intend to remain idle about. So. Many of you know that I'm a biker. I love to bike. I've biked the rides across Minnesota with my daughter Emma, and I still bike to and from work a lot. I used to bike down to Shannon. I used to bike down to Minnesota History Center sometimes, or bike down to NPR. I take up a lot of space on a bike. You know, so I'm a big target. Maybe that's why I haven't had an accident, is I'm too conspicuous. What is that on that bike? But I thought a good way to say goodbye would be from my bicycle. So it was only goodbye to the 50-hour work week for the University of Minnesota. I will still be engaged in a variety of other tasks. I'm sincerely grateful to all of you for coming and putting up with this for a long-winded retrospective of 40 years. Very grateful to those people that spoke on my behalf. Thank you very, very much for doing that. Grateful for that my family's here, and for the opportunity to have worked with you all these years. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. I know some of you might have some questions. We're going to get to those, but first I would like Dr. Tracy Twine to come up. She's the chair of the Kuehnast Committee. Mark, I think you might want to stay up here. You don't get to, it's not that easy. You're going to just slip out the door.
We only have 42 more plaques to get. And thanks, I think you only thanked maybe 1,950 people in that talk. Thank you all for coming today as this tribute to Mark. That's great. I want to thank the Kuehnast family, the Baker families. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to Carrie Jarko and Stacey Nordstrom, who really, we couldn't do this without them. And thank you, Kenny, for hosting us through all of this. It's wonderful news that you will still be advocating for climate science in the state and in general, but you are retiring from the university. You've given a lot of props to all of your mentors, and I just wanted to acknowledge how much the people who were hired after you appreciated your mentorship. We can't go into that today. That would take an entire other event, I think, to pay tribute to the mentorship that you provided to people like myself, but I want to thank you for that. And then the department has a gift for you, a plaque here that you can hang on your wall with some data that you have to manually record, but it does say that it's presented with gratitude to Mark Seeley on this stage and celebrating 25 years of the Kuehnast Annual Lectures.
Okay, we have some couple microphones, so if anyone has questions for what must be a very tired Dr. Seeley at this point, thank you for attending this marathon. It has been a real honor. I'm so thrilled that I got to take part in this true honor for one of my heroes. So if you have questions, our request is try and leave the story part out and just ask the question so we can get to the next person. After we're done with the questions, there will be a reception, and Mark wants to assure everyone he'd like to make time for each of you. But that also means that even in the reception, we might need to keep our comments to him a little bit brief out of consideration for the other 200 or so folks. But in any case, if you do have your questions, put your hands up and our mic runners will find you, and Dr. Seeley will do his best to answer your questions.
Well, I'll start as the mic runner. Mark, what's your next plan after you retire?
As some of you know, my first act is to have surgery and get my right leg repaired. The story that was alluded to on the cruise ship was a real one. On the Prairie Home Companion cruise ship in 2016, I never got off the dock. I had a spill down the stairway and I tore all the ligaments in my right leg. I did immediately fly home for surgery and have repairs, but the repairs didn't take. So it was a shocking admission on the part of the orthopedic surgeon to say, oops. But anyway, so the first act is to get my right leg repaired. Then I will do occasional things, maybe some writing. I'm still going to write for Minnesota Farmer Magazine. I'm still going to do some work with NPR and TPT, and I may tackle some more writing projects or speaking engagements, but that remains to be seen. First goal is to get well and be able to do things again. So, the other thing, since you asked, Pete, is I hope one of the things I'll be doing is mentoring the replacement faculty member that the university is going to hire. Right, Bev? I hope that the day. I hope the day won't be too far out that I'll be able to mentor or have a sit-down meeting with he or she to talk about the job and aspects that really need immediate attention and things of that nature. So thanks for bringing that up, Pete.